Well, hello and welcome to Help Me Believe, the show about Christian apologetics and theology. My name is Haden Clark, your host, and I'm excited for today's episode. Before getting into that, I want to say thank you to our patron supporters. Because of your support, I get to produce free material like this and put it up on the interwebs, so thank you so much for that. And you too, listener, can become a patron supporter just by following the Patreon link in the description below and becoming a supporter for only $1 a month. Other than that, I think we're ready to get into today's interview. And today my guest is Steve McRae. Steve, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing awesome. I actually got a little bit of sleep today. I have woken up and I've got my coffee with my green cup. If like that, woo,
Yes, it's a green
invisible.
screen. I was wondering if you
Isn't
knew
it? I
that.
got 4 of these. That's great. It's like magic. I can do magic tricks if I figure out what to do with 4 green cups.
That's great. I was wondering if you knew that. I didn't know. So yeah,
Oh yeah, I'm aware.
that makes sense.
It literally is the same color. It's like a lime green.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I didn't say anything in the before the show because I wasn't sure. I was like, well, I don't want to.
No, I'm aware.
But I'm excited to have you on. So thanks so much for agreeing to do this. I'm sure you've got a busy schedule, so I really appreciate you coming on to do this. But before I start asking you all sorts of questions, I thought it'd be helpful for the audience that may or may not know who you are, if you gave us a kind of a brief introduction of who you are and what you do.
Sure. My name's Steve McRae. I've been on YouTube for about 7 years. I do videos dealing with epistemology, philosophy, science, biology, physics, mathematics, like calculus. We basically talk about all kinds of things. And plus, I'm doing now a political show with somebody named Chris Hatley, a.k.a. the Atheist Pastor. We do that on Wednesday nights, 8 o'clock Pacific time. So, we're kind of a potpourri of different things on my channel, but basically it's all about facilitating discussions, having dialogues, talk about critical thinking, talk about how to go about having better discussions with theists, atheists, non-believers, believers, and we're just any type of discussion.
Yeah, no, that sounds awesome. It's definitely something that I've flattered myself as trying to do as well, as foster better conversations. I'm sure I don't always succeed at that, but yeah, that's definitely. I'm happy to hear that sort of thing's going on. So tell me about the channel. I know you just kind of mentioned it, but kind of how did you get started doing things, and kind of what's the general philosophy behind it?
Well, I got a couple of different channels. I have the Great Debate Community channel, which kind of was a catch-all channel that I've had for about 3 years or so. I have my own personal channel, which is Steve McRae, and then I had a channel called the Non Sequitur Show, which unfortunately I had a partner that was recently found liable for fraud, fraudulent conversion, unfair and deceptive trade practices, breach of fiduciary duty, and breach of contract. And I'm still in litigation in order to get that channel back, as well as basically proceeds from the channel, which was significant. It's about $100,000 lawsuit at this point.
Wow. Well, tell me a little bit. So, like you said, some of the dialogues that you're fostering, the things that you're doing, has to do with religion and philosophy of religion, things like that. So, what's kind of your history with religion? Were you once religious? Are you religious? Kind of that nature.
I was baptized Mormon when I was 17. I took the missionary lessons. I've read the Book of Mormon like 3 times. I went to Bible studies in the mornings, went to some Christian things every so often. I did believe for a while. I mean, there were some personal things that happened where people will say, this may be attributed to a deity of some kind, or supernatural things that you think are supernatural things that you don't have a causal mechanism for. So you kind of say, maybe there is some kind of a non-materialistic, non-physical substance out there. Maybe some intelligence exists out there. I don't know. But that didn't really last too long with me. After I got baptized, I joined the Navy, and of course, trying to be Mormon in the military is really difficult. I don't know about you, but if you've ever hung around a sailor, they tend to drink.
Yeah.
Prolifically. And then in 2008, I kind of stopped going, I stopped having anything to do with the church because of their stance on Prop 8 in California. And I didn't think the church should have been involved in that, on the proposition of gay marriage, because that definitely should have been something separation of church and state. And I was like, well, if this is God's church, why is God fighting against this? This makes no sense to me. And after that, I just basically been non-religious, non-denominational, non-theistic. But I was never really raised that way. I just kind of hung around friends that were. It was more of a social thing to begin with.
Yeah. This would kind of get us into kind of where we want to go today. But so how would you identify yourself with respect to the question of God's existence? You said non-theistic. Does that fall into...
my thing fell down.
No worries. You can.
That's okay.
You can stop and fix it, or you can leave it. It's perfectly fine with me. I don't care.
I don't care. People know I got a green screen. That's my studio back.
That's fantastic.
Um,
To make you feel better, I'll say that I once swallowed a fly live on YouTube once. But yeah.
I'm actually glad it fell because I got a fan back here. That's what kind of it's hot today. It's like 100 some odd degrees. It's ridiculous hot today. So now I actually feel the breeze of the fan on. So that actually worked out okay.
That's good. Yeah. So you said non-theistic. Would you classify that more in the agnostic camp, in the atheist camp? Do you not like those categories at all? Just
No, I'm a definitely agnostic, and I use agnostic the way that it's generally understood in philosophy. And I keep telling people the normative use, and what I mean by that is the uses as most commonly found. It's not the Huxleyan type of agnostic. Huxley did not use agnosticism the way that it's used most often nowadays. He used it in a different context. He used it more of an epistemological sense about the knowability of gods, and he also thought that both theists and atheists were not justified to hold on to their positions. They're not justified to say one way or another whether they even can hold a belief that God existed or not. So the agnostic in the philosophical context is basically somebody who holds the proposition is neither true or false. And you're just spending judgment on it. You're not able to evaluate and reach a conclusion. You say towards the God's proposition, I don't believe it's true, but I also at the same time don't believe it's false.
Right.
And so that's what agnostic is generally held as normatively. It is a psychological stance of being agnostic on the proposition. And I think a lot of people have a misconception of that because all I hear from a lot of the more prominent atheists is, oh, well, there's no middle ground between belief and disbelief, or no middle ground between belief and non-belief, which is true. But that's not where agnosticism lies. Agnosticism lies between belief and disbelief is actually understood as the belief of the proposition being false, the negation of the proposition. And when I hear a lot of atheists go, well, I just disbelieve, I'm like, well, you're telling people that you actually believe the proposition of theism is false. And they're like, well, I don't mean it that way. I mean, I just don't believe. I'm like, well, then you're confusing people who ever understand epistemology.
Yeah, I want to come back to the lack theist question in just a second, but kind of a follow-up question to what you were just mentioning would be, are you saying that you're agnostic in the sense that you would need better evidence to go one way or the other, or are you saying that actually we cannot know the answer to this question?
I don't say that you can't know. Now that would be more specifically a hard agnostic or a Huxleyan type agnostic that says the knowability of gods. But that's an epistemological question dealing with the knowability, right? When you're talking about theism, you're talking about the belief that God exists. You're talking about a position on ontology, existential, right? Because God existing is an existential question dealing with ontology. So we're asking people, what is your stance on the existence of God, right? That's what a theist says. A theist says, I have concluded that the proposition that God exists is true.
Right.
They believe God exists. It has nothing to do at that point with the knowability of gods. They're not saying one way or another whether gods are knowable or not. That's a different domain, right? And I think people have a hard time when they switch from a dosastic position, which is a dealing with beliefs, and they move into a more epistemological position dealing with knowledge, because the knowability question is a different proposition, right? One proposition is does God exist? The other one is God knowable? Those are vastly different propositions.
So would you say that God as classically conceived then as like omniscient, omnipotent, creator of the universe, it is at least theoretically or possibly knowable? It's just that you don't find the evidence sufficient, but you also don't find the negation of the proposition God exists to be sufficient either.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. Okay, when people say though, like, I am not convinced God exists because I haven't had sufficient reasons to believe. Well, that I consider to be a vacuous justification. Right. Because when you say to somebody, well, why don't you believe God exists? And they say, well, I don't believe because I don't believe. People would go, well, that's circular, right? That makes no sense. I mean, we basically know you don't believe because you don't believe. So when they say I don't believe because I don't have sufficient evidence, they're saying the same thing. Because if they had sufficient evidence, they would make a conclusion one way or the other. That's not a reason to believe or disbelieve. And for me, I'm saying nothing about the knowability of gods. What I'm saying is I don't even have a stance towards the belief one way or the other if God exists. And of course, I'll change my position as more information is acquired. It doesn't have to be exactly 50-50. You could have, be on more than one side or the other. You could be a little bit more toward the agnostic side, believing the proposition is false, or a little bit more toward the theist side, believing that it's true. And you don't have to be, convinced, right? Because we're asking about are you convinced? And that doesn't require certitude. It
Right.
doesn't require any kind of certainty. It doesn't require knowledge either to be convinced, right? It just requires that you have a belief that you're convinced enough to say, I think it is the case that the propositional content is true, ontologically speaking, right? If I say the sky's blue and I say, I believe the sky's blue, I'm affirming that proposition, no content, to be the case, correct?
Right.
So it's all dosastic at that point.
Right. Do you lean one way or the other?
Yeah, I mean, I generally lean more toward the atheistic side. Um, I think there's marginally some better arguments for atheism than there are for theism. But the funniest thing is when you hear somebody who's a lack belief atheist go, well, atheism is not a belief position. I'm like, okay, then you can't have arguments for it either way, right?
Right.
What does it mean to say that atheism is true? It's merely of its lack of belief, right?
Right.
Which is defeating their own purpose, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you really think there's no God, and you just try to default into the non-belief that you don't believe, how are you going to argue for that position? You at that point, it becomes a psychological stance rather than a propositional thing to be evaluated.
Yeah. So we've already kind of got into this, but like you're mentioning, just for the audience, in case anyone isn't familiar, there are a lot of atheists today, at least online. I don't know how much it carries over into the academy, if at all. But a lot of atheists will say that I really think it's just trying to circumvent having any kind of burden of proof. That's a bit of me projecting motive onto people, though, but it seems quite clear that that is the motive. But
I agree with you.
I don't like to project motive, but they sometimes say it explicitly that is the motive. And anyway, the way they do this is to say that, well, I don't have a belief. I merely lack a belief that God exists, and so I don't have this burden. But to me, it's like you could have that belief, and I agree with everything you've already said. But another thing would be that you could have the belief that God exists, and so the fact that you lack it means that there must be a reason for lacking it. And so, I mean, I don't feel like this even actually escapes a burden of proof.
I have an argument on that, actually. On my blog, as you know, I write a blog called 3M Philosophy. And one of the blogs I actually wrote was that very thing, that even lack of belief has a burden of proof.
Right.
And I actually proved it using logic, using second-order belief. Because a second-order belief is still a form of belief that requires rationality to be justified. Mm-hmm. It still requires some kind of, or I should say, justification to be rational. And a lot of people don't understand that, because agnosticism is a position on the question, but it's just not a direct position, right? It is an indirect position. It's called a second-order position. And because it's a second-order belief that you think to yourself, I believe that I'm unable to answer this question, it's a type of belief. It is something that requires justification is why you were not able to come to a conclusion either way. And you're exactly right. When somebody says, I lack a belief, there's a justification there. There's a burden of proof. And in epistemology, burden of proof and burden of justification are synonymous. I've never seen any usage of them that has any kind of demarcation between one and the other. They're used interchangeably. Now, that's not the same thing in law. The law uses them differently. The burden of proof has to do with what's called the burden of production and burden of persuasion, where burden of production is what you need to bring charges for a court case, and burden of persuasion is what you need to convince a judge or jury. But in epistemology, when we say burden of proof, all we're asking is what is your justificatory conditions to hold a particular position, or in this case, suspending of judgment with respect to a proposition. So you're lack of belief doesn't require a burden of proof. And I've given them many. Michael Martin, who wrote a book about negative atheism, he was a big advocate for the lack of belief usage. And even he says negative atheism has to be justified to be rational.
Right. I just, I don't think there's any way, perhaps you could help me out on this, is there any way to escape some kind of burden of proof? Because I just think as long as, I don't think there is.
Anytime you're having a conversation, anytime you're entered into a dialectic, you have a burden of proof. Even if you don't talk to somebody, I have a burden of proof to myself if I hold a particular belief, right? Why do I hold this belief? Right. And if you don't hold those burden of proofs, then you don't reevaluate your positions, right? Now, they're not always concurrent, right? These are dispositional things. You don't sit there and reevaluate all your beliefs at once, right? But as they prop up, you're like, you know what, I thought about that, and maybe I changed my mind. Well, the reason you changed your mind is because you realized you didn't have sufficient warrant to justify holding that belief still. You no longer became convinced of it, maybe, or you became convinced that you're wrong. If somebody says, hey, Steve, here's some facts that you made a mistake here. You had a belief that was false. I look at it and go, yeah, that's right. I was wrong. I'm no longer convinced I was right. I am now convinced that I'm wrong. Right? But we all, I don't even have to tell somebody that, right? But I have the burden of proof to myself to have rational thoughts.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
I think people are so concerned about a burden of proof, and they don't realize that there's many different types of burden of proofs going on at once in any conversation.
Right.
It's
No,
not like you have it
yeah.
or I have it. There's tons of different burdens of proofs going on.
No, that's a great point about. I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but it does seem quite obvious that even if you don't have a burden of proof, to me, which is just your choice, of course, you don't have to talk to me if you don't
That's
want
onus,
to.
right? That's persuasion, right?
Right.
I don't. If I say, hey, Haden, I believe the sky is blue. Do I really have an onus to demonstrate to you that the sky is blue? Of course not. It could be a self-assessment or an autobiographical relationship of me just telling you, this is my belief right now. I'm not trying to persuade you, but you want to know my dosastic state. I believe the sky is blue. But I have no onus to demonstrate that to you, do I? Of course not.
Yeah.
Unless I'm trying to persuade you.
Right. So this comes up a lot, and I saw an engagement between yourself and Aaron Ra on Twitter about rocks being atheists. So where do rocks come into the picture, and what's going on here with rocks and atheism?
Well, okay, that goes back a while to a person named Bionic Dance who didn't know much about logic and doesn't know much about philosophy. And even though she kind of gets it right from her particular way of looking at logic, it's not the right way to look at logic. Because what she does is this. She basically says there's, and by the way, she doesn't exactly relate it this way. You have to kind of parse it out. There's a universal set, and in the universal set, you have two complementary sets. You have everything that's in one set, and you have everything that's not in that set, the negation of that set, right? So if I have U as a universal set, then I have A prime and I have A. So anything not in one set has to be in the other. Does it make sense?
Yep.
Either you're an apple, you're not an apple. Duck, not duck. Right? Everything in the universe has to be in one of these two categories for the most part. We're dealing with classical logic. So she argues that if you're not a theist, then you're not theist. And she basically says not theist means atheist. Arendt does the same thing. This is a semantic argument at this point. It changes from a logical argument to a semantic argument because now they're saying that the not theist, we're going to call that atheist. So now you have a dichotomy between theism and atheism that's artificial because that's not exactly how it is in philosophy. But everything that exists must be in one of those two categories,
right?
Including rocks.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if rocks are not a theist, what's the only other category available to them according to their type of dichotomous relationships that these artificial relationships that they've self-imposed?
Right.
Well,
So,
then rock would be an atheist, right?
Right.
That's how they're arguing it.
Yeah. So the problem here would be the false dichotomy between that there needs to be another dichotomy between atheism and non-theism or not theist.
Yeah,
right?
well, the dichotomy there's a dichotomy between theism and not theism, right? That's true. Everything that's not a theist is not anything that's not a theist is not theist, right? Yeah. So if I have a rock clearly isn't a theist because it doesn't have a position that God exists. So okay, not theist. Now in that subset, right, under not theist, you have different positions. One of them would be basically you'll call it a non-theist. Now this is something that Arendt for some reason doesn't do, and it's still a bad argument, but it's better. Is limiting your scope. So non-theism only applies to persons, right? So it's just a person who lacks a belief, right? There's some problems with that as well, but he doesn't even do that in limited scope. He just says, no, you have a dichotomy, theist or atheist, and that's one of the problems with making these artificial dichotomies, because there's other positions. And this is why in philosophy you have theist who believes the proposition is true, you have atheist who believes it's false, and then you have the agnostic who doesn't believe either. Right? There's a more nuance there. There's basically a gradient. There's a granularity that they just don't have, and they say, oh, we're just going to throw everything into these one of two categories.
Yeah. No, I think I'm with you. I think obviously rocks would be not theists. They're not theists. They don't hold the belief that God exists, but they don't hold beliefs, period, which I think is why they don't fall into the category of atheism, because atheism is something that would only belong to persons. But
it's a psychological position.
But so would agnosticism.
Yeah. I mean, agnosticism is a psychological position. Now, it's kind of funny because there's a dishonest lawyer on YouTube that was talking about this very thing, and I was looking at it from an internal critique of what they were saying, and they actually literally dishonestly edited what I said to make it appear that I said rocks are agnostic, or agreeing with that. Even though for years I've had my positions out there and I've never argued that rocks are agnostic. Because to be agnostic, you have to actually try to evaluate the proposition and then suspend judgment. Rocks don't do that either. They're like a rock is amoral, right?
Right.
It doesn't have morals, but doesn't mean it's immoral, right? It's not, you don't say rocks are immoral because they don't have morals, right? You may say that with a person, maybe, but no, they're amoral. So there's a lot of confusion there. But yeah, the whole rocks being atheist thing is, I don't know why they think that helps their cause. It makes them look very silly.
Yeah. I want to say one more thing about that, but before I forget, I always forget to do this, sorry. But I want to mention to the live audience that if you have a question, you can submit it. I'll address it near the end of the interview during the live Q&A portion. Be sure to tag at Help Me Believe before your question. Kind of helps me see who actually has a question. And please, by all means, direct all of your questions at Steve. I don't want to answer any hard questions tonight, but no, I'm just kidding. But anyway, yeah.
Who does?
Yeah, right.
I'm caffeinated. I'm good to go.
Yeah, I think you're pretty good on this subject, so I don't think you got anything to be worried about.
Once or twice. It's like one subject that I read a lot on, you know?
Yeah, you never thought that you would spend a lot of time defending the proposition rocks are not atheists, but here you are. And
no. Well, actually, no, 5 years ago, I used to have these arguments with Bionic Dance. I kept trying to explain to her, no, stop saying this. It's foolish. But she wouldn't get that. Look, you can make anything into a semantic argument. I can say dogs equal felines. Felines equals cat. My dog Spot is now a cat. It's like these are semantic arguments. When you try to change the term not theist to atheist, you run into problems.
Yeah. No, for sure. Is there a way, this was the question, is there a way to parody this from my side? Like to say, well, I don't have a burden of proof because I'm trying to think of how I would do it. I don't believe that God exists. I just lack the belief that God does not exist. I don't know what I would say.
Well, this actually is what's called my WASP argument.
Okay,
this
great.
is it's called a weak atheist special pleading argument. I came up with it a while back. I mean, I'm not the first to actually kind of think about this particular argument. I'm the first that I know of to formalize it and actually show it to be the case logically using predicate logic. And it to this day is still unassailed. And it's not a difficult argument to actually grasp unless you're a lack belief atheist who just for some reason wants to make it about semantics and definitional things, which is not. It is a logical argument. It has to do with fallacious reasoning, has nothing to do with semantics. But it goes like this. If an atheist wants to define atheism as merely the lack of belief that God exists, then a theist can define theism to be the position of lacking a belief that God does not exist. If the atheist does not allow the theist to do this, they are guilty of special pleading. Right? Because it is definitely a special pleading argument, because now you have an atheist saying, well, I want to define atheism this way. Okay, you're allowed to do that. But if you do that, you have to allow the theist to do the exact same thing for the negation of the proposition. Because for every proposition, you have a negation, right? If the sky is blue, it is not the case the sky is blue. Every proposition is like that. So when you believe the proposition for theism, you have the negation, which is believes that the proposition is false. That's not a dichotomy, right? Believes true and believes false is not dichotomous. Believes true and not believes true is a dichotomy. Mm-hmm. But you can not believe it's true and you can not believe it's false, being agnostic. And so my argument is basically telling lack of belief atheist, look, if you want to hold the position that you merely lack a belief that God exists without holding the belief that God does not, because not believing does not entail that you believe God does not exist. But if you believe God does not exist, it does entail that you do not believe, clearly, because you don't believe if you believe God does not exist. Yeah. So for the lack of belief atheist, they are also lack of belief theist. And if you want to call lack of belief atheism, then you have to be able to be called lack of belief theism. So all these atheists out there going, well, I'm merely lack of belief. Okay, you're a theist. And if they balk at that, they have their special pleading. Right. I have yet to have anybody assail that argument, and it's been vetted by people that really do know their stuff. But that's it's called my WASP argument. It's made the rounds. Matter of fact, somebody called Matt Dillahunty on the Atheist Experience the other day. Somebody that I know. By the way, I never advocate for people to do that. I've never called the show. I never want to call the show, and I don't advocate anybody to call the show running my arguments. But this person did, and they didn't understand it.
Yeah. Now we got somebody in the comment section actually with a question about that, but I'll get to that whenever we get to the Q&A.
Oh, yeah, the person who calls in the audience.
Yeah, probably so. Let's see. Kind of moving away from the question of atheism and the definition there, just out of kind of things that I was curious to ask you about, what is your favorite argument for the existence of God? And by favorite, it can mean the strongest, or it could just mean, however you want to interpret the word favorite.
I happen to like the argument from contingency. And it's not that I think it actually gets you anywhere. And for those who don't know, the argument contingency basically goes something along the lines of everything that exists is either contingent or metaphysically necessary. Okay, so if it's if not contingent, it must be necessary. There are no other options for those things. And if it's contingent, like we're contingent beings, meaning that we do not exist in all possible worlds. We have to exist in at least one, which is the one that's actualized, but we can't exist in all. We're not a metaphysical necessity. So if we're a contingent being, then everything prior to us is a string of contingencies, a causal relationship. And there's only three possibilities that can end up with. One, it could be an infinite regress of just causal relationships, right? Contingent, 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 all the way to reverse infinity. Now that's completely logical. There's nothing illogical about that, but it's just the mind doesn't want to accept something like that. The other two options are contingent, 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 and then you hit what's called a brute fact, right? Just a contingency that exists. That's brute fact. That's also hard to wrap your mind around. What would be a brute fact? It's something that we can't even apprehend. Our minds can't apprehend what this brute fact even is, but there's some contingent brute fact. And the other option is some kind of metaphysical necessity. So you have a causal relationships of contingencies ending in a metaphysical necessity. The theist sometimes will come along and posit that metaphysical necessity to be a god. Now, I do tend to brute fact when it comes to justifications, right? There's what's called classical foundationalism. So I do tend, when we talk about beliefs, I tend to go to properly basic beliefs or to a classical. It's not really a brute fact, but it's a properly basic belief, right? Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to the ontology of the universe, I'm willing to actually even say I don't accept an infinite regress. It's possible, but there are ways around that in justifications called infinitism. But I think the most likely case for the argument contingency is a metaphysical necessity. I think there is something about the universe that could be no other way, and it would be that way in all possible worlds. The problem I have with the argument from contingency is if you can posit a God for it, is that the argument from contingency has to satisfy what's called the principle of sufficient reason. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't actually do that when you posit God, because when you posit God, you have to be able to say, well, why did God actualize this particular world out of all the possible worlds that he actualized? If you can't answer that, you don't have a reason. And if God did it arbitrarily, if he just said, I wanted this world for whatever reason, he just picked it, right? There's not really a reason for it then. It was just arbitrary. Like, why did I stub my toe 60 times in my life, rather than 59? Why is there one more gratuitous evil than there should have been, right? And a gratuitous evil or natural evil would be something that is not like, what we consider to be evil, like, going and killing people. But a hurricane is a gratuitous evil. Stubbing a toe is a natural evil, they call it.
Yeah.
And so how would you, what is the explanation then? Just positing God doesn't explain anything, because either it was arbitrary or he was beholden to actualize this possible world, which means there was something of higher value than God, which a lot of theists would go, well, no. Nothing, God can do what he wants. He's not beholden to any kind of higher value. So it presents a problem to the theist. But if a theist is going to posit God as a being that exists, I think it makes sense to posit God as a metaphysical necessity, at least. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of some.
Repeat it back to me, because I have no idea what I just said.
No, it sounds like to me that you think that something exists necessarily, and positing God as that which exists necessarily, you actually think might violate the PSR.
Well, I don't think it violates PSR. I just think it doesn't really satisfy it. That's all. I mean, it possibly could, maybe somebody could come up with a better argument for it. But I can at least see a theist going, I think the explanation is a God. I don't know exactly what it's explaining though, mm-hmm. But there is some kind of metaphysical necessity. Maybe it's a placeholder. I'm going to call that metaphysical necessity God.
Yeah.
Could be quantum.
No, I think it's really cool or interesting or something like that you do think there is something metaphysically necessary. I know Graham Oppie, I think, thinks this now. He's an atheist that I love to listen to and read.
He's awesome.
Yeah.
I've had him on my show. He's
Yeah,
incredible.
have you? Yeah, well, good. Yeah, so he's somebody that I do like to listen to and read, and I think he's of the mind. Now, I don't know that he always was actually, but I think he is now of a mind that there probably is something which exists necessarily. So it's kind of like most theistic arguments, at least that I'm aware of, will go in kind of two stages. They'll try to get to something like metaphysical necessity, and then they'll try to get to God by teasing out the attributes or something like that.
Yeah,
So
no, I agree. I think that's exactly how they would go about doing it.
yeah.
Matter of fact, I'm doing a episode tomorrow on Agree to Argue with Dr. Fuzz Rana. He's going to be talking about the watchmaker
Mm, wow.
and intelligent design and teleological versus teleonomy. Wow, that's a bad.
It's a hard one.
Um, yeah, but one of those things is, as a metaphysical being, that would be the intelligent designer that exists, regardless of our understanding of the universe. It's some kind of metaphysical necessity that has to exist as an intelligence, because a lot of people will run the argument, well, you have the laws of logic, right? The laws of logic are conceptual. And if they're conceptual and they have to exist, to be conceptual, they have to exist in some kind of mind at some time.
Right.
I particularly buy that argument, but that's one of the arguments that I see people run.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Um, the other question I had, just kind of out of curiosity, was what would be most likely? I actually like this question quite a bit. What would be most likely to convince you that God exists? Would it be something like one of these philosophical arguments, or would it be something more like an experience, say of the miraculous or something like that? Of course, it depends on what the word miraculous means. I know, but experience versus some kind of argument.
Yeah, I think it would be experience. The arguments I don't think will ever convince anybody, because if there was a good argument for God, I think the whole world would be convinced, right? I think that most of these arguments basically they tell the believer what they've already kind of believed, right? And it just kind of reinforces. And a lot of these arguments are no longer even used that much. I mean, Aquinas' 5 ways, right? Four out of his arguments aren't really used that much. The prime mover arguments and some other things. Although at the time they were solid, probably arguments. People were going, well, yeah, wait a minute. What did cause the first motion? Why did we have spin? Spin had to come from somewhere. Something had to move that to begin with, the prime mover. But as we learn more about science, we can actually probably say, hey, look, some of these are due to symmetry breaking. We don't have a full understanding of it, why there's clockwise, or why more things clockwise and counterclockwise. Why is there more matter than antimatter? Why is symmetry breaking not always perfect? Why is there some inconsistencies in symmetry breaking?
Yeah.
But we understand that there is such a thing, right? So we learn more since Aquinas. But one of the arguments he has is a teleological argument, and that's basically just saying that the universe is due to some kind of metaphysical being, God, the watchmaker that designed the universe. But I don't think it proves anything, right? It's an argument, it's an assertion, rather than something that's experiential, where I say, hey, look, I'm experiencing something. If God exists and he comes down and shows himself, yeah, it's going to be a lot more something that I believe, assuming that I'm in the right mindset, that I'm not losing my faculties. Then yeah, I think experience is important. The problem with that is that's nothing we can relate to other people. Our experiences are our own, right? They're sense data, and it's subjective, meaning that not when people talk about subjectivity in philosophy, I think there's a misconception. When I talk about subjectivity, I'm talking about something that's sense data to myself that you don't have epistemic access to. For example, the way I experience a color, you don't have access to. The way I experience pain, you don't have access to. Those are all subjective things, right? An objective things is something you do have access to. Like if you want to know, hey, how many gumballs are in a jar, you can objectively look at it and count, right? Mm-hmm. That's something that's objective. And so it would be enough to convince me, maybe, that God exists, but I don't think experience is enough to convince somebody else.
No, for sure.
Unless they just trust you explicitly, but then you're just relying on their testimony. That's all.
Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. And yeah, that's actually really cool. You just worded it exactly how I would. I think the thing with objectivity and subjectivity, I think is I'm not saying intentionally, but sometimes when I speak with atheists and I try to relay that to them, like, when I'm talking about religious experience. So, for example, like I couldn't give you a philosophical argument for why my wife exists. If you say, "How do you know your wife exists?" I say, Well, she's over there in the other room. I don't know what to tell you. If I brought her over here on the camera, then you would be convinced, I suppose. But yeah, it kind of works like that, and I think that's the way you described it. I think is really good, and I agree with it as a theist who does think that the philosophical arguments succeed. I do think that the experience is much more would be much more convincing, or it
Absolutely.
makes sense that it
Yeah.
would be.
Yeah, and we're experiential creatures, right? I mean, let's say, if I say, well, I don't believe you're married, okay, well, you can show me your wife, but I'm like, well, show me the marriage certificate. Well, I think that's forged. You can always have
Yeah,
doubts,
you could
right?
do
And
that.
I
Yeah.
and I don't think that it makes sense to have too much doubt. I mean, it's one thing to have a little bit of healthy doubt. It's called ordinary skepticism. That's fine. But when we have these people on the skeptic community who think skepticism and doubt are the same thing, they do nobody any good, because first of all, it's not what skepticism really actually is in philosophy. Skepticism deals with the ability to acquire knowledge. Do we have it? Right? The Pyrrhonian skeptic says we don't even know whether we can get knowledge or not. The academic skeptic says, knowledge is not possible. Now, I'm not a skeptic. I believe that knowledge is possible, but that's open to revision, but only because I think it's an easier way to approach conversations with justified true belief. But even there's clear problems with getting air problems or value of why is it any more value to have a justified true belief a justified belief, a true belief rather than a justified true belief, right? If it's a true belief, why does it matter if we have knowledge? Because it's still true. I mean, there's really nothing even added to that.
Right.
But we as creatures, we like to say, well, we know something. Okay, let's say I know it. Does that mean I'm certain? No. Does it require certainty? No. It just requires the proposition to be true. It requires that you believe it, and it requires some kind of justificatory conditions or reliability if you go for reliabilism. And there's many other different theories of knowledge out there too. There's more than just two.
Right.
But no matter what you pick, okay, I'm not going to sit there and doubt everything that I see. Do I have a cup here? Well, wait a minute here. It's over here now. Do I have a cup
Well,
in my
now
hand?
I can't see it, so.
Yeah, you can't see it. I mean, so, I really don't like the skeptic community when all they do is doubt everything. Well, you have to demonstrate that. No, I don't. Unless I'm saying that I could demonstrate something to you. Like when a theist says, I believe God exists, and the atheist says, well, can you prove that? I wanted to smack them. I mean, I literally, they look like an idiot, if I can say that. I mean, because the theist is not telling them they can prove God exists. They're not saying I can demonstrate God exists. And you're straw manning them when you do that to them. And how would they like it if they say, look, God doesn't exist? And the theist says, well, prove it. Well, I ain't got to prove it. Of course not. Right? They don't have to prove that because that's not their claim. You only have to prove what you claim you can prove. So if I say I can prove 0.99 repeating equals 1, and I'm saying, Haden, look, I can prove mathematically that 0.99 repeating equals 1 in calculus or algebra. And you say, okay, great. I'd like to see that. Then I could demonstrate it for you, right?
No.
But the theist is not saying I can prove to you God. They can say I believe God exists, and let me tell you why I do. Let me tell you the justifications, right? Let me give you my reasoning, and maybe you might agree. And you go, man, those are some really good reasons. I think you're right. I think you convinced me. You persuaded me.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I think I could talk to you about this stuff all day long. I mean, you're making a lot of points that I like to make, and that I sometimes get pushback from in the atheist community. I'm not saying that there aren't Christians or theists who do the same thing, but yeah. So I think this is an argument for why everybody should at least have some acquaintance with philosophy.
Oh yeah, well, philosophy is a tool of reason, right? When people say philosophy is useless, and by the way, I was that guy about 7 or 8 years ago. I was that guy. Philosophy is useless. It's a bunch of crudgy, curmudgeons sitting around, drinking scotch, which I do now, smoking cigars, which I don't. I quit smoking 5 years ago. In a comfy chair. I actually got one. But when you learn about philosophy, you learn about how to reason. You learn about how to use, basic logic, and you're able to disarm arguments. You can look at an argument and go, yeah, that's not a valid argument. Well, why isn't it valid? Because it doesn't use any rule of inference properly. Okay. Or you can say, hey, that's not sound. Why is it not sound? Because the premises aren't true. Why aren't the premises true? Well, because this isn't this. Oh, okay. And people get better in their dialectics by reformulating their arguments. I'll throw an argument out there occasionally, like on Facebook or Twitter, and it'll get ripped. And I'll go, yeah, you know what? That was pretty bad. Let me try to reformulate it a little better. And I'll try to fix it and try to shore up those arrows have been thrown at it, right? Those are people that have been trying to assail my arguments. So when you first start with an argument, you're probably going to have people assail it. It's probably not going to start off that great. But every time somebody does, if you then shore it up, you then do a little bit better. You a little bit word a little bit better. It's going to become eventually at the point, sometimes, unassailable, or at least for all practical purposes. And I have multiple arguments out there that so far have never been assailed. Now, there are people who claim they have, but I have a standing thing. If you think you've assailed my WASP argument or my burden of a justification argument or one or two others that I have, Gumballs and God, which is not technically an argument, but on my blog, if you can convince a PhD in philosophy that I'm wrong, I want to talk to that PhD in philosophy because none of them ever have. And I'm not trying to sound condescending. It is that I've had hundreds of people say I'm wrong, and then when you ask them, well, how am I wrong, they show no indication they even understand the argument,
Right.
or even basic logic.
Yeah.
And it's like saying, hey, this calculus thing is wrong. Okay, well, where's this wrong? Oh, because this, and this. And you're like, you don't know what an exponent is.
Yeah.
You don't know what a derivative is. How could you tell me the calculus is wrong if you don't know what a derivative is, right?
Yeah.
That's what I see very often when people try to sell my arguments.
That's how I feel whenever people say Aquinas is outdated. No, I'm just messing with you. But
Well, I mean, look, Aquinas, I got to tell you, for his day, his arguments were very, very well thought out.
Yeah.
And people still might believe in them today, and probably there might be some reasons for it. I mean, they're not like they're bad arguments. It's just I think there's other explanations. Back then, nobody had other explanations, right?
Yeah.
Nobody knew about quantum stuff, right? Nobody even knew about gravity back then.
Yeah.
Or at least, not to our understanding we have it for general relativity.
Yeah. No, I'm mostly teasing. Yeah, I think just on that, if I could say one more thing. Well, I guess it's my show, so I guess I can't. No. But to say one more thing about the philosophy thing is just that I think philosophy really humbled me really quickly. Like it was a shell shocker.
It was an eye opener.
Yeah. So I remember I'm not walking in because it's online, but I remember my first class in metaphysics, and the first week I was just like, this might as well be Latin or Greek. I have no idea about any of this. And so it's just kind of like I guess it kind of forced me to restart and just be a lot more humble I don't want to claim this now, because now I kind of understand how argumentation and burden of proof and everything you're just mentioning works. And I want to be much more careful and precise with what I say. And it also gave me a deep respect for opposing views.
Yeah, and it's funny because what I talk about on my channel, a lot of it, like I said, is normative. I mean, if you take a philosophical course, any college, these are the things you're going to basically learn, right? So when I have people arguing against me, it's like they're arguing against every college in the world because this is not controversial stuff. I mean, some of the stuff that I talk about is just basic stuff to educate people. Like if I say disbelief is the epistemic disposition towards a proposition that the proposition is false, that's not controversial.
Right.
I mean, that's just not. But you go to an atheist group, oh, no, that's not what disbelief is. Disbelief means you just don't believe. No, that's not how it's understood. If you want to use it differently, okay, but if you go read a paper, that's not how they're going to be using this term 99% of the time. I mean, it's just, why confuse people? Because when you go read a paper and it says, and I have papers that I have in my disposal that will say this, you have dispositional states of believe, disbelief, and suspend judgment. Well, clearly there are three different epistemic statuses, right?
Right.
Clearly. I mean, one is the belief that is true, one is the belief that is false, and the disbelief is you have no belief either way. This is what you find when you go read papers and books on the topic. So why are people so against learning the topic as what you would learn if you learned it in college or read a paper? I don't understand why atheists have so much pushback on that. I don't. Because if they want to learn these things, how are they going to go read a paper if they're using the usages that Aaron Ra uses? The paper would make no sense to them.
Yeah. It's almost synonymous or analogous to the anti-intellectual crowd on my side of things, the Christians who don't think we should make arguments and things like that. I mean, they just use words and things that are just not the accepted usage of them, and or something like that. That just popped up in my mind.
Creationists will do that, right? Evolution is just merely change. Theory is merely guess. These are called sensu lato, general definitions. And definitions, by the way, are not prescriptive. Dictionaries are not prescriptive; they are descriptive. They're usually what's called synchronic usages, meaning that they're telling you how a word is generally used during a specific time period,
Right.
right? How it's used, not how it's supposed to be used. There's a big difference there. So when you open up and you do go Google foo and go, oh, here's Google Dictionary, it's telling you how the word is currently understood in general parlance, right? By the general masses, and that's fine. I mean, atheism is understood as a lack of belief by some groups. Okay, so if you see a descriptive dictionary that says atheism is disbelief or lack of belief, by the way, those are two different things. That's fine. That's a description. It's not prescribing usage. I'll tell people this until I'm blue in the face. Dictionaries do not define words. Don't care what you learn in third grade. It's wrong. Dictionaries do not, unless they're prescription dictionaries, which don't really exist. That's not what they do. They just describe usages. You know?
Right. No, that's right. Okay, so whenever you survey the theistic, non-theistic landscape of interactions online, or it doesn't have to be online, but just interactions, are you mostly hopeful or pessimistic? I mean, this conversation is between a non-theist and a theist, and obviously I mean, to my mind, it's been great. But it's not always the case. How do you see it kind of more broadly, generally?
I hate to say it, but it's not obviously a true dichotomy, but I definitely see a bifurcation of groups. And I see one group that wants to have these conversations, whether it be theist, whether it be atheist, whether it be agnostic, whether it be a theological cognitivist, whether it be an apatheist, doesn't matter. They just like to have the conversation, and they'll be able to talk to anybody. And that's the kind of people that we foster. Those are the people that value my channel. Those are people that come and talk to us on when we have open discussions. But then you have groups of people out there that don't want to have honest dialogue. They are not honest interlocutors. One thing that I talk about with my co-host Cheshire in a show we do called Caffeine Corner is something called Greece's Maxioms. And part of that is called the cooperative principle. And the cooperative principle is basically, if you want to have a discussion with somebody, you pretty well should go in with a mindset of their person's trying to be honest. Right. You're trying to be honest. You're trying to have a rational discourse. Now, there are times to what's called flout these maxims, right? But for the most part, they're not prescribed. They're not prescriptions, right? They're not prescriptivism. They're generally observations how most people have a conversation using the quality of maxim of quality, maxim of quantity. These are different things to say. Okay, how much should you relate in a conversation without going overboard? Should you like add in all this other information if you're having a dialectic? Well, probably not, because it's going to confuse people. And so these are kind of guidelines that people use. And the people that not having the good discussions, the people that just want to argue and get nowhere, they seem to just disregard all these different types of things, like the principle of rational discourse or cooperative principle or Grice's maxims. They don't care. They're not there to, one, change the mind of the other person. Two, they're not actually interested in the discussion itself.
I have to say, because I've been beating this dead horse, I can't say for years because I'm quite young, but as long as I've been online, I've been beating this dead horse for years, that if you come into a dialogue doing the things that you were mentioning, there's no way on earth I could possibly reach the conclusion that you actually want to change my mind, which is supposed to be the point of a debate, or at least one of the points of a debate. So what
are debates nowadays? Nowadays, it's not about changing the mind of the opponent. It's about getting the audience to agree with you.
Right. Yeah.
Right. That's all it is. And by the way, I'm part of a debate thing. I mean, I started the Great Debate community on YouTube, even though it was there's a couple of people that existed prior, but I'm the one that really kind of honed it and took it and molded it and promoted it for a very long time. But you know what? I realized that it's not really about the debate. And by the way, debate just means an argument, a discussion. And arguments are good, right? It's not like a fighting thing. Right. Or an argument is a back and forth. But I think it's more about the discussion, right? And so that term debate, I try to shy away from it, because when people hear debate, they think it's so adversarial, where you're trying to fight, and it's all about the audience. Hey, am I going to convert the audience in the debate? Because that's normally what you do in a debate in high school or college. It's about persuasion, right?
Yeah, rhetoric. Yep.
Rhetoric. Yeah, exactly. Contemporary rhetoric.
I view, and exactly. I know that's not like an accepted definitions or anything. It's just in my mind, a debate is more of like a formal thing. So I had a debate with Godless Engineer on Jesus Mythicism the other
Well,
day.
my heart goes out to the.
Well, it went pretty well. I enjoyed it,
Well,
but it
I'm
went
gonna
so
give him this.
well.
That's one subject does know about. I'll give him that.
Yeah. So I think it went well because it was a formal debate, and that's kind of how I think of the word debate: is that it's formal. I have 15 minutes. You have 15 minutes. There was 10-minute rebuttals, 5-minute closings.
How many times did Tacitus or Josephus get mentioned?
Well, actually, it was more narrow than just Jesus mythicism. The question was, did Paul believe in a historical Jesus, based on the 7 letters of Paul that are undisputed? But
Gotcha.
so actually, they didn't get brought up. But I did.
Good, because if I hear Josephus one more time, I'm going to just lose my mind in those discussions.
Yeah. So I did watch his debate with IP on your channel. Didn't that happen on the non sequitur channel?
Yeah, Mike.
Yeah.
Yep.
But anyway, so that's kind of more what I think about whenever I think debate, and the word discussion for me kind of is like what we're doing right now.
Yeah, and I prefer the discussions because I'm not here to like change your mind or anything. I'm not here to impress the audience. You're asking me questions. I'm here to answer them to the best of my ability and enjoy myself doing it. I think those are the best discussions I have on my channel. I don't want my guests to feel adversarial unless it's clearly going that way because, come on, you're going to have some bad guests. It's going to happen. It's going to go south. At that point, I figure, I might as well make it into the dumpster fire that it's already going and go from there, right?
Yeah.
You may not have that happen, but it sure happens on mine. Anybody who watches my channel, I could tell you got some people in your audience right now that knows my channel. They're like, yep.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, that happens.
But yeah, I do think that sometimes the formal debate structure, it was necessary. So, well, I'm trying to think of how I want to say this. I wasn't going to get into an informal discussion with GE on Jesus mythicism. I said I would agree to it if it was a formal debate. I didn't feel like, and it's just me passing judgment. It's not anything against his character or anything. I didn't feel like it would be a good conversation for us to do that. At one point, he tried to make it into that in the middle of the debate, and I said, no, we're going to stick to the time constraints we had. That was my judgment. So I do think there's sometimes that a formal debate like that.
Yeah. Look, I've done it. Look, the first debate that I ever had online, it was on Mac Revolution, and it was with somebody named Wayne Fillmore, who was a young Earth creationist. And we were kind of friends, but we actually got a little bit of a beef. And he was just like, well, you won't debate me on Mac. You won't debate me. And I'm like, why not? And I debated him. I studied for like 2 weeks for this debate. I'm not even fronting. I couldn't say the word Paralipithecus Catalonicus for the first time. I had to like sit there and practice saying Paralipithecus Catalonicus. I'll never forget it now. And there was a 12 million year old fossil that was found in Spain. But I did a whole presentation for him, right? Because I wasn't about the audience. I really wanted him to understand that evolution's a real thing, and that young Earth creationism is bunk. I know a lot of these young Earth creationists. I know the people that write for the journals. I'm in correspondence with a lot of them. I'm mentioned in the Journal of Creation. I'm just recently mentioned in a paper by Dr. Lachelt, acknowledgement. And I'm going to be mentioning on Talk Origins, hopefully next month by Dr. Hankey. And so I facilitate these conversations. And so I really have a vested interest in dissuading people from being young creationists. This is a pet peeve of mine. It's like flat Earth, right? It's wrong. You don't want people to have false beliefs like that because it leads to other people having false beliefs, which makes education 10,000 times more difficult. And you know what happened to him, Haden? Do you know what he did after our debate?
What did he do?
He actually went to go look at what I said was true or not.
Yeah.
He left Young Earth Creations about a month later.
Yeah. Wow. That's impressive.
And he wrote an article about me on Biologos. He's now a writer for Biologos, if you're familiar with them.
Yeah, I am. They're kind of the theistic evolutionists.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I mean, it can happen. But it's very rare.
Mm-hmm.
It's very
yeah. I mean, it is rare, and I understand why. I mean, I got to say that the probability of me leaving Christianity or theism's got to be pretty small.
What convinced you? Now my turn. I get to turn it around.
Yeah.
What convinced you?
I grew up a Christian. And now I do think that the theistic arguments for the existence of God, like the philosophical ones, I like the prime mover. I do like the Aristotelian argument from a change.
The four causes. Do you think there's different causal relationships? Because Aristotelian had 4 causations. Right?
Oh yes, like a formal cause and a material cause and an efficient cause. Yeah.
Which makes sense.
No, it makes sense. I mean, I have to say that I don't have the philosophical depth to defend it or anything. But yeah, when I read it, it does make sense. There's something that brings it into existence. There's things that hold it into existence right now. There is a material component to us and things like that. So, I mean, I don't have anything against them. I don't know that I would have the breadth to defend them. But yeah,
Did you ever have experiential experience?
I do think that I had an experiential experience and a religious experience um, in Lubbock, Texas, when I was 20 years old. So I can back up real quick. I did grow up a Christian. It was more like a nominally Christian type of thing. We did go to church every once in a while, but beyond that, I mean, my dad, I feel like, is a good, godly man. I would describe him that way. Um, but we didn't talk about it a lot or anything like that. And so I just thought we had good morals. Wasn't necessarily a religious thing. But anyway, so at 17, 18, I don't think I would have called myself an atheist, but more like an apatheist. I just didn't think about it at all. Didn't care. And then something happened for sure. Whenever I was about 20 years old in Lubbock, Texas, I was actually on my way to a fraternity party, just driving in my car like I did every weekend. And for whatever reason, something happened internally. And I was not on drugs or anything, or even been drinking or anything like that. Nothing traumatic had happened in my life at that point. In fact, everything was going for me. I was going to school to be an engineer. I was pretty excited about it. And for whatever reason, I just had to pull over. I'm not an emotional person. That's also another thing that's hard for me to explain. I'm not saying there isn't ulterior explanations, but what happened was just that I had some kind of a breakdown and pulled over on the side of the road and felt convicted that I was living my life wrong and that I was doing sinful things, even though sin had never really been in a category for me. And I just turned around, both literally and metaphorically, and went home and prayed to God and felt like it was real. And so that's why I do say that the experience, interpreting experiences like
Oh,
that,
sure.
is definitely the most convincing thing for theists. I'm not. I do like the apologetic endeavor. I do like philosophy and stuff like that, but I don't pretend that those type of things are more
Use them more to supplement your
right.
experiences and try to relate them together.
Yeah, and I don't
I
have any
don't, I don't see
problem
a problem
saying
with that.
that. And I know that some people would try to say, yeah, it's called a confirmation bias and things like that. But
No, I don't really think it is. Not if you're doing not if you're doing it honestly,
mm,
right? I mean, you still have to look things objectively.
yeah, so
And
yeah,
but I heard you say there might be other explanations. So you
hmm
realize that there might be. You're not saying, hey, look, this is the only explanation, and therefore I have concluded this because it's the only explanation. That's a whole different argument.
yeah. So at the time, I probably would have thought that, but now about 3 years later, I'm in seminary, and I've never thought about questions like, how do you know God exists? How do you know the Bible's God's word? How do you know that Jesus rose from the dead? Those sort. No one's ever asked me that before. I've never thought it to myself before. I just had that experience that totally turned my life around, and I would have said the evidence is the fact that I changed so much. I don't know how else that would have happened. But then I started having doubts about that. I think because at seminary, this is at least how I interpret everything that happened. In seminary, you really dive deep, so to speak, into things. And I just got to some depth of systematic theology or whatever that I had to say, how do I even know that any of this is true? Because I'm getting really out here into the, digging deep and kind of, I know I use the word deep, but kind of out here on the fringes of things. And then it's like, how do I even know that any of this is true? And so I kind of had that. Um,
So what would convince you it's not true?
yeah. So I would take something, you know,
That's kind of a hard
no,
question
no,
there.
no. No. I know the answer. I'm trying to think of how I want to word it, which would be I would take, if you had a good enough argument. I don't think it has to be, because I don't think it has to be certainty to be a theist. I have to be
Correct.
to be fair. I have to say it in the opposite direction. If you had a good enough argument against the existence of God, or even I think in order to be fair, I would also have to say even if you had a good enough objection to the current arguments to the existence of God, like the Kalam or the contingency, the Aristotelian, and things like that. If you had good enough objections to those, then in order to be consistent, I would have to accept that they do not succeed, in which case I would be dependent on that experience that I had. And I don't know what I would do then because I do.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
All right. So what would you do um, if you've actually found out that God does exist, but it wasn't Christianity. It
Right.
was Islam all this time. Would you worship that God?
Oh,
Because I mean, the same question they ask the atheists all the time. Well, I love this too. By the way, when they say if the Christian God is real, would you worship him? And the atheist goes, no. And I'm like, you're lying through your teeth. You would. What idiot would sit there and go, hey, look, he's an omnipotent being that's going to send me to hell? No, you're going to be kissing its. Can I say?
you can say ass if you'd like.
You're gonna be kissing its ass. I'm telling you, because there's no moral cause to be had, because nobody's going to care that you're like, oh, well, you're an evil being and I don't like you because you're Yahweh, you drown people, whatever. Yeah. By the way, I don't think you believe in the Great Flood, but I mean, you're not going to sit there and do that. You're going to be like, oh, no, I'm not going to want to burn for eternity, because at that point, there's no moral cause to be had, because nobody's going to care. It just seems I don't believe anybody's going to do that. No. I just don't think anybody's going to be like, you exist now. I'm not going to worship you. Yeah, you probably would. I sure the hell would. But what about if you found out it wasn't the Christian God, but it was the Muslim God?
Yeah. So at first I thought the question was going to be, what would you do if Christianity was false? I would probably just be a classical theist. But yeah, I mean, if Islam was true, then I would want to follow Islam.
Yeah, no, I think that's a sane answer, actually. I mean, whatever is the case, then you have to accept it. And again, good, bad, or indifferent, I don't think anybody really has the right answers. There's just too many denominations. There's just too many variations, too many versions. I think most people generally go what they're comfortable with. They hope that they got the majority of it right. And if there is some kind of omnipotent being up there, and he's a benevolent being, I don't think he's going to punish people for just not getting it right. It just doesn't make sense to me. That would not be a benevolent being. I mean, right. So I would tend to more what's called universalism, if you're familiar with that term. Yeah. That basically God would be, everybody's kind of saved, because I don't think the whole hell thing makes any sense. I think that was all.
Yeah, so I'm not. I don't believe in eternal conscious torment because of the Bible. Actually, I just don't think that the Bible actually supports that. I think that's.
I agree. Yeah, Sheol and all that doesn't support the hell narrative.
I do think. I interpret the biblical narrative to be annihilationist. That God is, but. I think every Christian, and I talk about one of my friends in the live chat's a universalist. I think, and we say this all the time, I think every Christian is a hopeful universalist. I hope I'm wrong.
I disagree with you. You know why? Because I know people that will revel that people are going to hell.
Yeah, you're right. And so I always come back to him and I say, I really think some people are hopeful eternal conscious tormentists. And
right?
And he laughs at that, and we both do. But I really do believe it. I think you're right. And that blows my mind. Because you're supposed to, the Christian religion, I can't speak for the other two monotheistic religions. I don't actually know. But the Christian religion, I think most people would say, is an evangelistic religion. And so it's like you ought to desire them to be saved. And so therefore, that if you desire them to be saved, I'm using the Christian lingo here, then you just by definition would be a hopeful universalist. You want everyone to be saved, right?
You would think, but there are some just sadistic people out there.
Yeah, there are.
Being Christian doesn't change that.
No, it doesn't.
I've actually had people say, I'll be happy to look down while you're burning in hell. It's like, okay, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And my other question I asked, this is one of the questions I've asked for on Agree to Argue, or at least the members of them. I had asked them, if God is going to judge who goes to heaven and who goes to hell, that's a binary option, right? Assuming there's no purgatory, assuming there's no middle ground, there has to be some kind of line of demarcation, because, how could God makes that final judgment? Matter of fact, if you remember the old gods with Anubis, I think it was Anubis that he would take a feather and take a scale and take the heart and weigh it. And so he has some kind of objectivity to say, okay, you're going up, you're going down. If you read the books called the Incarnations and Immortality series by Piers Anthony, it was very similar. The soul was weighted either to go down, or soul was weighted to go up. It had a buoyancy to it, right? But what kind of God would go, hey, look, you were so close, man. Haden, you had most of it right, but you didn't get everything right. You had this one thing that was just wrong. So close, you're gone.
Right.
There's such a litmus test to be had there, and so lack of granularity, because it's not fuzzy logic, right? It's not like maybe not. It is, you're in or you're out.
Right.
You're in or you're not in. If you're not in, you're out. So I find that to be a very poignant question when dealing with a certain version of the Christian God.
Right. Yeah, it certainly applies to eternal conscious torment, and there's perhaps a version of it that applies even to my position on annihilation. When I say my position, I just mean that seems to me to be the biblical position.
Oh, I agree with you. I think annihilation
Annihilationism.
makes more sense in the Bible as well, actually.
Um,
Yes.
so it's like, but when I hear stuff like that, that's just for me is an argument because I do accept that God exists, and it would be an argument for universalism, like you're saying, and so it really doesn't bother me that much. I'm like, I hope I'm wrong, so I hope your argument does succeed. But yeah, um, yeah, it is interesting to contemplate the, what would I do if this, and what would I do if
Yeah.
that?
No. See, but you're willing. See, that's why apologists like you that are willing to answer questions and entertain hypotheticals, you're going to go far. People
Well, I
won't want to
appreciate
have
it.
to. Well, I'm serious. Because people do not like people that obfuscate. People do not like people that stonewall. Don't be afraid to answer the hard questions, because
Yeah.
so what? You get it wrong. You change your position. You say something. You go, look, I say this once, but I've modified this. I've learned since then. And you just express yourself, because we both seen theists that will obfuscate to no end. Look at
Oh,
Site 10 Bernanke, who I actually like. He's a friend of mine. But dude, the guy would not answer questions. I mean, he's the kind of guy that goes, well, I don't do Bible studies with atheists. Then how does anybody challenge your positions?
yeah.
Because
No,
he doesn't want that.
no. Yeah, and like I said, I think it comes back. I mean,
I applaud you.
well, I appreciate it. I applaud you as well. I think for just personally me, it comes back to I say my training. I'm not claiming to be a professional or anything. My training in philosophy has changed me a lot, and actually, a lot of Christians are going to use that as a weapon against me. But yeah, the philosophy.
Wait till they find you talk to me. No,
Well,
I have a lot of Christians that actually do like me. I don't know.
I like you a lot. This
What
has been a
up?
very fun conversation. One last question before we I go scrolling through here to see what questions we have is, what advice do you have to foster better conversations between theists and non-theists?
Go to my channel, watch Caffeine Corner.
There you go. Yeah.
Seriously. We go through every week on Mondays, and we talk about how to have better conversations. But I think the big thing is, one, try to go in with an honest intent, and don't think that your interlocutor is all of a sudden being dishonest just because you're a theist. I know a lot of people bring baggage to a conversation. Aaron is famous for it. He literally thinks every time he's talking to a theist that they're lying to him, right? He doesn't take any of that to be honest. And it's a shame, because I've seen him, like, for example, he was talking to a doctor, what was his name? I can't remember, but the guy is a young creationist, but his philosophy was good. His biology clearly not so much, but philosophically speaking, he was on point. I have a philosophical friend of mine who analyzed the conversation between them and said, yeah, I don't see any problems with what this doctor was telling him. This is how it would be. But Aaron wasn't having any of it, because he's still thinking that this theist, who's a young creationist, who clearly is wrong there, must therefore be wrong on his philosophy. And that doesn't necessarily follow, right?
Yeah. I
So
think
don't think everybody's having a bad intent and a dishonest intent. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to get over that, because there are some people that do have bad intents, and I'm sure that there's. I'm not projecting anything onto anybody, but I know that it is the case. There are Christians, or excuse me, there are atheists who have had bad experiences with religious people, and I say this from a sympathetic point of view. I understand why then you might have animosity in all your conversations with religious people, and perhaps vice versa. But yeah, I'm not saying that's where it always comes from. But yeah, here's a question. It's a quote. It looks like they're quoting Matt Dillahunty. It says, "There is no not P. There is only P. No, atheism is not defined in terms of theism. Atheism is not the belief that there are no gods." Matt Dillahunty. What are the problems here? Is the question from the audience.
Well, for every P, there's a not P. There's a not condition. It's a negation. What Matt does seems to want to understand, because I think he does know this. I'm at the point now, I think Matt's dishonest. And I hate to say it, because I really can't stand the fact that I have to just call out him to be dishonest, because I know people that do know him that have explained this stuff to him. And in private, he seems to get it, but in public, won't give any leeway. And so when he's saying that's not what atheism is, he is becoming a prescriptivist. And he has lied about me. He's absolutely lied about me. He claims that I'm a prescriptivist. I wrote a blog article in 2018 with my positions, very clearly stating that I was a descriptivist, not a prescriptivist. And so when he's saying that you must use words a certain way, or that's how it is, he's only using that within the domain of his atheist experience, right? In the domain of the atheist community of Austin, or in some group of atheism. He has yet to show that in philosophy, The more normative and more understood usage of atheism is the belief that God does not exist. That's supported by Stanford Encyclopedia, Dr. Draper. It's supported by Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Dr. McCormick, both peer review. Supported by Cambridge, supported by Oxford, supported by Rutledge, supported by Blackwell, supported by Rowe, supported by Burgess Jackson, supported by Oppie, supported by JJD Smart. I mean, I could go on, P.K. Moser. I mean, there's so many different names that support this. People have asked, okay, well, what philosopher doesn't support this? There are none. There are only 4 people that even wrote against it that I can find. And by the way, I've read these papers, okay? I'm not just, blowing smoke here. I've actually read these papers. I've had them cited on my blog. But the only 4 people that actually advocated for a negative type position that Matt holds to are Anthony Flew in 1972 with the presumption of atheism, which, by the way, he acknowledged in that paper that atheism was the belief that God does not exist, but he wanted it changed. That was the whole point of his paper. 2, Michael Martin, who he actually believed that negative atheism still required a justification, but he thought it was a better for utility. And same with Stephen Bullivant, who's a theist. He argues from utility, right? And the other one would be George Smith in A Case Against God. But for the most part, all they're saying is we rather have it be the negative. And the reason for that is for demographics. It's for political reasons, not philosophical reasons, right? They want more voting power. Mm-hmm. That's it. From a philosophical standpoint, there is no philosopher that I've ever met that says atheism is the non-belief of God, and that's it. There's no other definition. Nobody's ever said that besides Matt Dillahunty and Aaron Ra, and they're not actual philosophers.
Yeah. So when he says, if that quote's accurate, I was trying to just understand the point that he was trying to make in that quote was not P does not exist. But
I don't know. I've heard that before. Is that Muir that said that?
I don't know. It sounds like trying to say that negative existential statements are vacuous, but it's not a negative existential claim.
Right.
It
kind of is. I mean, you're a negative existential claim is that the claim is God doesn't exist, right? That is a negative existential claim.
Right. No, I'm saying,
but
yeah. I don't know. Never mind. It's kind of getting me confused. But anyway, here's another question for you, Steve. It says, why did Steve say that God choosing a particular world to exist is arbitrary? And so I think this is back to whenever you're talking about the contingency argument. It seems like an assertion. I'd kind of like to have him unpack that claim a bit. Thanks.
Well, actually, what I said was if God created this world and he didn't have a reason, it would be arbitrary, right? Because again, positing God as a metaphysical necessity for the argument from contingency is that it satisfies PSR, right? So there's only a couple different things. Either God created this world with reasons that he had to create this particular world, right? There's no other options, which would be he's beholden to some kind of value that he says he must do it this way. Or he could have been just, I'll pick this particular world completely, right? It's possible, right? God could have said, yeah, let's do it this way. But no matter what you pick, whether it was by necessity, by arbitrary, or he had his reasons, we don't have access to God. We can't ask him, what were your reasons? It doesn't satisfy anything. It doesn't explain anything. The whole point of the argument from contingency is to explain something by the principle of sufficient reason, which I don't even behold, by the way. I don't think the PSR actually is true. But let's assume that it is. That's fine. But if I just say, hey, Haden, God created this world. You say, okay, well, why did he create this particular world? I have no idea. I can't ask him. Yeah. It's non-explanatory.
Right.
That's why.
What if you're a theist who believes that God does not? What if you're a theist that believes that God does not exist? More specifically, that he is not of the category of things that exist. Do you understand that?
That's
do you understand that question? Because I didn't really understand.
No, because a theist is, okay, generally speaking, again, these words have usages, right? So if you want to go read something in philosophy, the term theist has 2 general usages. One, in non-classical theist, which would be anybody that has a God belief, right? Or classical theism, which would be the personalized God, right? So a deist would not be somebody who believes in the classical version of God. So they would actually be more along the lines of an atheist or non-believer. They would deny the Christian God. So in the classical theist approach, theism refers to a very specific personalized deity. I don't work within the classical theism realm. My blogs are non-classical theism. It doesn't matter which one you pick, as long as you know what you're talking about, right? As long as you say, look, my schema is non-classical theism. I have a friend, Dr. Kenny Rhodes. He argues in classical theism, right? To him, a theist is somebody who believes in the Christian God. Nothing wrong with that. But he knows when I use the term theist, I'm not using it that way. And I know when he uses the term theist, he's not using it that way. You know what? We still have amazing discussions.
Yeah.
Right. So we still know how we use each other's, these words. But that there's a distinct, if you say you're the theist and you don't believe in the Christian God, I don't know what that would mean.
Right.
Unless obviously you don't believe in any God. I don't know what that would mean. You could believe obviously in, some other God.
Yeah. I'm looking at the time, and I almost forgot about our time constraints, so I apologize. But
That's
Steve,
okay. I got about 5 more minutes.
yeah, Steve, thanks so much for agreeing to do this. I really appreciate it. Sorry
This
to
was
anybody.
fun.
Yeah, we'll have to do it again for sure. It was a lot of fun. And yeah, so again, to the audience, thanks so much for joining us. If you want to support the mission here to help me believe so we can do more conversations like this, just follow the Patreon link in the description below, and you can become a patron supporter for as little as $1 a month. Steve, thanks so much for joining me, sir. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, and I hope your channel does really well. And yeah, I'd like to come back anytime, and any theists that that want to have these discussions, because we just barely touched the surface.
Yeah.
I would love to talk to more theists, because if Matt Dillahunty and Aaron Ra don't want to have these discussions and they recuse themselves because they're just going to say that I'm wrong by fiat, I'm going to turn the arguments over to theists and let them run them, because because logic's logic. And I'm sorry, Aaron, I'm sorry, Matt. You can't just bulldoze your way through an argument and just say people are wrong merely because you think they're wrong. You need to demonstrate it. What does Aaron say? If you can't show it, you don't know it.
Well, thanks so much, Steve.
Thank you, buddy.